And now, it's The Law Show on CL 650. A comprehensive look at everything you need to know about the law. Now, here's Sterling Fox.
You don't have to live like a refugee. Very interesting choice of music to begin today's edition of The Law Show here on CL 650. Good morning and welcome to the program. I'm Sterling Fox, joined in studio by Gordon Maynard and Rudy Kischer from Maynard, Kischer, Stojicevic, Vancouver Immigration and Citizenship Lawyers. Gentlemen, welcome back. It's great to see you.
Good morning, Sterling.
Good morning, Sterling.
Well, we started off with the song about the refugee, and clearly our producer, Dwayne Bishop, sensing a theme already in the program before we even got to introduce you. That's what we're going to devote a lot of time on the program to today, given the current, well, shall we say, level of interest in refugees planet-wide. And Rudy, you, one of the lawyers in the firm, bring a unique bit of experience to this team, this trio of immigration lawyers, because you have actual hands-on refugee experience in your career as a member or a worker for the United Nations High Commission for Refugees.
Yes, that's correct, Sterling. I mean, I've been working with my two partners at Maynard, Kischer, Stojicevic for 10 years, but prior to that, I spent 1 year as a lawyer working with UNHCR in Hong Kong, specifically on resettlement issues. So I was based in Hong Kong and charged with resettling refugees that have been recognized by UNHCR and trying to find them a home. They weren't allowed. Hong Kong wasn't added to the territory. China had signed on to the protocol on refugees, but when Hong Kong was ceded back to China, it wasn't added. The argument being from Hong Kong is we have enough people, we can't take anymore.
Right.
And so one of the few options that UNHCR was left with was trying to find home for these refugees, people that had come to Hong Kong, which had a very sort of open visa-free regime, meaning it was easy for people to get to Hong Kong if they could get on a plane. And then if they were stuck there, what was happening at that time is they weren't able to get further. Usually they had planned to come to other places, and because of security issues, they were stopped, or it was found out that they had a visa and they were stuck in Hong Kong, and there was nowhere for them to go. And so UNHCR was trying to help resettle these people to countries that would take them. And there are about, at that time, there was probably about 9 different countries that had signed on to agree to take refugees that were stuck overseas.
Right.
Canada being one of them, Canada, and the U.S. being another one.
And as a lawyer with the United Nations Commission for Refugees, what specific legal tasks did you perform?
Well, we'd have to, it was sort of more preparing the application to be submitted to these different countries. So we would basically...
Oh, you'd help with the paperwork and make sure it was all the ducks were in a row.
We'd interview all the recognized refugees and make sure that and we then put an application, a bunch of submissions to different countries that said they were willing to consider refugees.
Right.
So you know, we'd deal with the Swedish ambassador and send a bunch of claimants over there, packages, applications that they would then assess. Or the U.S. example was another taker who would come in from Bangkok and arrive, and then we would have prepared different packages for them to look at, different people for them to interview and decide if they want to take them.
Right. Gordon Maynard, for a firm, a citizenship and immigration law firm like yours here in Vancouver, the refugee issue is not front and center on a daily basis for you, is it? That's sort of a distant government thing. Does Maynard, Kischer, Stojicevic deal with refugees or their families on matters that you can help them with?
We do. It's not a principal area of our business by a long shot.
Of course.
But all of us have had experience dealing with refugees. All of us in our career have practiced some level of refugee law, or through our involvement with the Canadian Bar Association, we've assisted in the reviews of laws that have been passed by the government over the course of the last decade in particular regarding refugee determination and refugee process. So we're really quite familiar with it. In fact, the other day, several weeks ago, we had an articling student leaving the firm. We had a partner's lunch to take her out and celebrate her time with the office.
Well, nice time.
And this was at the time when the Syrian refugee crisis was arising, early September.
Mm-hmm.
And we started to have a dialogue at the table about whether or not our numbers as Canada, as a nation, our numbers of refugee acceptance were appropriate and fair in the scheme of the Syrian refugee crisis. And this became a very fertile discussion. And we found ourselves discussing legal issues, resettled refugees,
right.
Canada determinations, numbers, where the refugees are in the world.
Mm-hmm.
And that dialogue has been carrying on since then for the last several weeks. We talk about it relentlessly. And it's led to this show because the figures are important and
right.
the issue is important.
Okay. We'll get into crunching some of those numbers, and of course there's the little matter of an election campaign going on, so there's a lot of numbers being thrown about by all sorts of political players in all of this, and what we're trying to do here, folks, is just boil this thing down to the facts, and let the politicians spin them in whichever direction they want. What we're going to aim for in this hour is as much of the facts as we can possibly reveal. And Rudy, let's go right back to square one. This is the Law Show, so let's talk about the refugee issue from with a measure of understanding. What, for example, is, and you've been there, what is the legal definition of a refugee?
Well, the legal definition of refugee starts with it has to be somebody outside of their country of nationality, which confuses a lot of people. And creates a lot of misunderstanding sometimes because people assume because somebody has fled a war, for example, that they would probably just fit the definition of refugee. But if they're still within their country of nationality, for example, so Syrians may have fled part of Syria and have left their home because it's been bombed
sure.
or because they fear going back there, they would not fit the definition of refugee. They are what the UNHCR considers internally displaced people, but they are not refugees.
So they're still, and that's because they haven't left their country of origin, even though their house may be a couple of 100 miles away and they're in a relatively safe zone, because they're still inside their country, they're still not refugees. They haven't left yet.
And you've got to understand where, so the idea of, the legal definition of refugee that we work for today comes from the 1956 Protocol on Refugees, which was designed to deal with people fleeing communist Eastern Europe.
After World War II.
Yes. So,
okay, 1950s then,
in the
right?
1950s. So, people that were leaving East Germany and coming to West Germany, or people that somehow got across the border and ended up in France, what were we going to do? How did governments deal with that? How was the UNHCR set up this system with the backing of the United States that we were going to recognize people fleeing their country of origin, so they had to be outside the country of origin, and they had to be fleeing what we call persecution.
Right.
So it can't be just prejudice. It can't be, I'm hated by most of the people in my country. I don't get along. I have different views. You have to be fleeing something that's called persecution. So it has to be a level where you actually fear for your safety.
And
right?
Off the tail end of the word persecution, Gordon, comes the word asylum. Refugees are said to be seeking asylum in foreign countries. What is asylum?
Asylum is a permanent or long-term temporary solution to allowing people to escape the persecution. So by getting recognition as a refugee, as a person outside their country and fearing persecution with a well-founded fear, they're given protection, they're recognized. And the question is to put them in a place where they can reside and carry on with life.
Right.
That is one of the solutions to the refugee problem. So right now, in the world, there are 20 million refugees seeking protection. They are, let's call them displaced persons.
Okay,
they may not,
that's what they were back in the 50s.
No, this place is more like 60 million.
Well, that's internal and external.
Yeah.
I'm talking
Okay.
about people outside their country.
Okay.
Outside their country, there's 20 million people.
Just wandering.
Wandering, and
Okay.
they're looking for protection.
Right.
If they are recognized as refugees, then they may either be given asylum in the country that has recognized them,
Right.
and so allowed to remain there, or they may be designated by the UNHCR while they're in a country that's sort of temporarily holding on to them. And if they're recognized by the UNHCR, then the UNHCR can also resettle them, which is to move them from the country where they are temporarily to another country that will receive them.
Okay. Now, here's a taxpayer question for you, Rudy, Mr. Former UN guy. If a country grants asylum to a refugee or a group of refugees, what obligations does that granting country assume towards those people?
Well, it's very limited, actually. I mean, what the treaty provides for is that they not be refouled. So you cannot be returned. So basically, they're allowing them the right to stay and not to be returned. There is no sort of under the definition that they provide sort of the necessities of life or education, etc. Now, UNHCR, of course, pushes countries to sort of allow them to work, allow them to get an education, etc. But that's not part of the treaty. It's not a mandatory part, right? So Canada, on the other hand, right, when we let people in, have taken on the position, well, we're going to let them work, we're going to let them go to school, right? We're going to let them on a path to permanent residency. There are many countries that don't allow that. For example, in Lebanon, Palestinians have been living for years as refugees, so they're not going to return them back to Israel, right, or force them out, but they won't let them own land. They won't let them go to higher education. They restrict their movements. But that the bare bones of the treaty is just to allow them in. So the actual cost that the UN requires isn't high. What is the actual cost? As Canadians, when we have somebody in our own country, we give them health care, although the Conservatives have cut that back in certain aspects. We allow them to work. We allow their kids to go to school. So there is a cost. Yeah.
Now, Gordon, again, a rudimentary question, I get, but just by way of getting a grasp on this massive problem, we talk about people in Canada. We've seen mayors of cities and provincial premiers trying to organize or at least galvanize their populations, their communities, into some kind of citizen-driven action. But when it comes to accepting refugees, who has the power to do that? My understanding is only the national government. Is that the case?
True. At the end of the day, only the government can give the final approval for the entry of an individual or retaining of an individual in Canada, give them that status to remain here. So there's three processes that Canada uses. One of them is refugee resettlement. Canada has long been a party to refugee resettlement. So that's when the UN outside of Canada has designated somebody as a refugee.
Right.
UN officers have done that assignment and the designation. And then Canada agrees to accept a number of those into resettlement. Okay, so those resettled refugees. Canada, Australia, and the United States every year collectively take in 90% of the world's resettled refugees.
Interesting.
Well, it is interesting, but you have to take that with a grain of knowledge. There are 20 million displaced persons out there. Every year, the UNHCR only designates about 100 and some odd thousand.
Just because of the
for resettlement.
For resettlement.
And this is simply that's all the paperwork processors can handle per year.
That's more a result of that's the amount of places that countries have said we'll take.
Okay.
And
right?
so those places are pretty much taken up by U.S., Canada, and Australia. U.S. takes the biggest number. They take about 70% of them.
Okay.
Say 70,000. Canada and Australia each take about 10%. Canada typically takes 12,000 total.
Resettled refugees per year.
Per year.
Okay.
Okay. And lately, since 2005, they've had Canada has allowed private sponsorship of refugees. So the group of five individuals in Canada can get together and collectively sponsor a refugee.
Any group of five, but it has to be a minimum group of 5 people?
5 people.
Yes, and they have to pledge a certain amount of money and they have to meet the requirements.
They have to make a certain amount of money.
Okay, we'll take a break and we'll talk about those specifics in a minute, but please carry on, Gordon.
So that portion now of the 12,000 a year that Canada takes in resettled refugees, private sponsorship makes up 2/3 of them.
Okay.
And so Canada itself as a government is only funding 1/3 of them. That's the current figures these days.
And I noticed, though, that, as is always the case in Canada, Rudy, Quebec does have its own independent right to accept immigrants. And I noticed they're moving refugees and immigrants. They have their own deal, and they're already moving on this file ahead of the national government. And the national government, in this case, can't do anything, can they?
They can't. No, there's the Quebec-Canada Accord. Canada, unlike other provinces, has a special accord that gives it a lot of control over who comes into Quebec. They can designate people, leaving just certain functions to the federal government in terms of security screening, health screening, and other inadmissibility. So there's been a little bit talk in the paper about is the federal government going to sort of keep time with what Quebec's demanding?
Right.
Which, as we'll talk about later in the show, the federal government has been a bit of a roadblock, I would say, in terms terms of what Canadians want to do to help refugees.
Well, clearly, Canadians from coast to coast to coast have expressed enormous interest in the current refugee situation, and many millions of us have demonstrated to some degree a willingness to participate in the acceptance of refugees into our country. So suppose you're one of those groups of 5, or a member of a parish in a church that's going to commit to sponsoring someone. Exactly what obligations will you have to assume? What responsibilities and commitments must you make in order to make the deal successful and to bring a deserving person into Canada? We'll get all the specifics of what you and your group can do and expect when we continue on The Law Show here on CIL 650.
There's more of the show still ahead. This is The Law Show on CIL 650.